The primary purpose of Uniquely Human, the podcast, is to educate and inform. The views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute educational or medical advice. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with each individual or family for specific guidance.
Uniquely Human, the podcast, is produced by Elevated Studio. Music is graciously provided by Matt Savage of Savage Records.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prezant, clinical scholar, researcher, and consultant on autism and neurodiversity, and a Brooklyn boy raised in the big city.
And I'm Dave. I'm none of those things, and I grew up on a farm in Illinois. But being on the spectrum myself, I have plenty of personal insight to lend.
And this is Uniquely Human, the podcast, a show that illuminates and celebrates autism and neurodiversity. Today we have a very, very special guest who I just shared some time with a few weeks ago at the Motormorphosis Conference in Washington, D.C. And our special guest is Professor Vikram Jaswal. Welcome, Vikram.
Thanks, Barry. Great to be here.
Yes. So I will tell you a little bit more about Vikram in just a couple of moments. But let me just give a little bit of background here. I first met Vikram, and I believe it was in 2018 at the University of Virginia, where I was kindly invited down to give a talk based upon Uniquely Human. But I also had the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time with a group of non-speaking communicators, and they were participating in a particular course that Vikram was involved in. I'll let him talk a little bit more about that. So we met a number of years ago, 6-7 years ago, and developed a nice relationship since, and saw him again last week at a conference that we'll probably talk about a little bit. So Vikram is a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. He's a developmental psychologist whose work has addressed a range of topics in cognitive, social, and language development. Not so far away from my training decades ago.
That's right.
Even though I'm a speech and language pathologist, most of my coursework was in developmental psychology. Vikram's current research focuses on communication and social interaction in autism. His work is inspired and informed by the lived experiences of autistic children and adults and their families, something we value so much. So, Vikram, talk a little bit about your professional journey and what led you to what you're doing now, especially with the focus on literacy and communication through spelling and through typing for non-speakers.
Sure. Well, I'm new to this autism game, relatively speaking. I mean, I was trained, as you said, as a developmental psychologist. I spent the first 10 or 15 years of my professional career addressing questions about, how kids learn the meanings of words so quickly, how they take advantage and acquire cultural knowledge. And I really enjoyed those questions and doing that research, which was with typically developing kids. But then it was 2015, the summer of 2015, I had a transformative experience. And that transformative experience took place because I was invited to participate in a summer institute that Elizabeth Vossler, who I know is a good friend of yours as well, invited me to join. And Elizabeth is a speech language pathologist, and she was running this sort of summer institute for 9 or 10 non-speaking autistic young adults, all of whom at the time were communicating by pointing to letters on a letterboard held vertically by a trained communication and regulation partner. And, I hadn't ever spent time with a group of folks who communicate in this way, with autistic folks who communicate in this way. But to say that I was sort of blown away is an understatement. I mean, it's changed my life. It's changed my research program. It's changed the way I think about the world and about psychology and communication. And, I still struggle putting into words exactly, what that experience was like and why it was so transformative. But I can give you two vivid memories that still stand out today that maybe help to explain.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the sessions during that summer institute where I had been invited to talk about research in autism, even though I didn't know very much about autism at the time. One of the sessions was devoted to this really prominent theory about autism, suggesting that autistic people lack a theory of mind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a really problematic theory, but it's been very prominent and it's gained a lot of attention. And basically, I know you will have talked about this on the podcast before, but theory of mind represents a person's ability to reason about another's beliefs, desires, goals, motivations, intentions, and so on, to recognize that people's behavior is motivated by those underlying mental states. So, if I reach for a glass of water, you can infer that I'm thirsty and I want to drink the water. It's not just some random collection of movements. So my behavior is motivated by my mental states. Anyway, so I was describing some pretty problematic experiments with autistic folks that claim to show that autistic people lack a theory of mind. And
Vikram,
yes.
Vikram, as I recall, the term mind blindness was used.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's problematic in a whole nother way, because of course, again, I know you've talked about on this podcast before, but who's blind to whom, right? I mean, it's non-autistic people who are blind to autistic people, or vice versa. But this problematic series of experiments that I did a little bit of description of to this group of non-speaking folks, they took great offense at this suggestion that autistic people lack a theory of mind. And so I said, well, it's good to criticize work, but even better would be to come up with an experiment that you thought could demonstrate that autistic people understand others' intentions. And so one guy, he spelled out, well, if I were designing an experiment, I would create a video of, it would show somebody walking toward the bathroom door. I would pause the video and I would ask the participant, what is this person about to do? Right? The underlying belief being like, oh, if they say he's about to go to the bathroom, then that shows that they understand that he has an intent. He's intending to go to the bathroom. I thought, wow, that's pretty elegant, pretty simple. But then even more impressively, maybe 5 minutes later, there's a kid in the back of the room who, had been jumping around the room, listening to music. And this is just demonstrating my own ableist assumptions. I had assumed was not really paying attention at all to the conversation as it was unfolding. But he raises his hand, he's shaking his hand, and he spells out, if I were a subject in so-and-so's experiment, I want to know if the actor was autistic. And I said, what? Huh. Why would you want to know if the actor was autistic? And he said, because if the actor was autistic, maybe he was going into the bathroom, not because he needed to use the bathroom, but because he needed a sensory break. Right? I mean, wow, talk about theory of mind. I mean, he's reasoning about an actor in an experiment that's not ever been done, whether that actor is autistic and what different intentions he would have depending on I was just blown away.
Goodness. How many kids I've known where the teacher says, well, he keeps on requesting to go to the bathroom when he doesn't even need to go.
That's the mind blindness, exactly, that you were just talking about. Yeah, so that's amazing. And, over and over again, as I've gotten to know autistic people, of course, they understand other people's beliefs, goals, desires, and they recognize that behaviors are motivated by underlying intentions and so on. So these experiments, they weren't made up. I don't think anybody was faking the data, but they were designed in a particular way that was not suitable to allow autistic folks to demonstrate their underlying competence. And maybe that'll become another theme we can talk about later in the conversation. The second memory that I wanted to raise was another really terrible domain or literature that unfortunately autistic folks are subjected to IQ tests regularly. And the IQ tests, for autistic people generally, not very well thought about, but for non-speaking autistic people in particular, right, they're so problematic. How can somebody who doesn't have a way to express themselves using language-based communication participate in a lot of standard IQ tests? So we're talking about the terrible state of IQ testing and autism. And then I raised this experiment that was done, I think it was 2015 or so, maybe 2013, by this really progressive group of Canadian autism scientists. And in that study, they used a strengths-based approach to investigate intelligence or IQ in a group of elementary school-aged, non-speaking autistic kids. And by strengths-based, I mean it wasn't requiring them to make a verbal response. It wasn't requiring them to make motor responses that are different from those that they would otherwise use in their daily lives. And this group showed that most of the non-speaking autistic elementary school-aged kids who couldn't even be tested on standardized tests actually scored within the normal range on these strengths-based IQ tests. And I was like, oh, isn't that great? And, it was interesting, like the tribe, that's what they came to call themselves, this group of non-speaking autistic young adults that I was hanging out with, they thought it was a fine study, but, this interesting conversation ensued about the utility of IQ tests and what IQ testing is meant to do, and so on. And so, like, they were less impressed than I had been because they actually didn't think that investigating IQ or intelligence was actually going to be that useful for anyone.
And how do you even define intelligence?
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, one of my favorite quotes from education researchers is, if we think defining intelligence is difficult, imagine how difficult it is to define lack of intelligence, right? I mean, it's just crazy. Anyway, at the end of this conversation that day, we're going around the room and these folks are sharing with me any last thoughts. And this guy sitting next to me, he spells out, Vikram, how can I collaborate with you at UVA? Why should we let the Canadians have all the fun? And remember, this research was done with this research I'm so excited about was done by this Canadian research team. And so, like, to say that I was charmed by these folks and just like overwhelmed with the kind of joy and experience that I had with them is an understatement. So that's the story of how I kind of got into this line of business.
Yeah. And I think the elephant in the room is shattering this notion that speech is the best indication of a person's intelligence, whatever intelligence is or however it is defined.
Right.
That's for sure. Something else I really want to emphasize based upon what you said is that autistic people, for probably a number of reasons, but especially motor control reasons and sensory issues, may not appear to engage, give the same signals of attention and engagement that another person may give, even though they may be processing what they're hearing and even thinking about what they're going to communicate by typing or spelling.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I mean, we do all have the tendency to make assumptions about people based on how they appear to us and what our expectations of them based on their appearance is and based on the behaviors that they're showing. And it's easy to assume that somebody who's apparently not paying attention, who's looking away, who's jumping around the room, who's racing back and forth, maybe who's engaging in kind of repetitive behaviors, like it's easy for a lot of folks just to write them off. And boy, what a tragedy, right? Because, right, one thing we should have all learned in kindergarten is you can't judge a book by its cover. And there are lots of reasons why people behave in ways that we might not understand. And that doesn't necessarily mean anything about their underlying abilities, interests, competencies, and so on. So yeah, that is something that is particularly for non-speaking autistic people, I think, who many of whom don't have a way to correct the assumptions that other people make about them, right? Because they don't have access to an effective way to communicate. Like, imagine what life is like for folks who are constantly being misunderstood and have no way to say, wait a second, hold on, I want to learn about Copernicus. Or wait a second, you thought that I'm not interested in interacting with you, but I'm just having a hard time controlling my body right now because I'm so excited. Like, boy, what a challenge.
Incredible. So you since have established a lab at University of Virginia. And if you could kind of share a bit about the vision and the mission of the lab. So, I mean, as you said, you being blown away by your observations, and I'm not going to be self-indulgent and talk about my experience, but spending a couple of days with the tribe that many years ago, 6-7 years ago, I had the same response coming from a speech language pathology and autism background. It's like, whoa, okay. One thing I did want to mention very quickly is as part of the process, the tribe or members of the tribe read Uniquely Human, and they sent critiques along to me.
Do you remember some of those?
About the book. Elizabeth arranged that, yeah. So talk about the Jaswal lab and the kind of work that you're doing. And Dave is a scientist, so I'm curious about his feelings about some of the experimentation that you've done and that you're planning.
I was going to say, not only this, but like, how does one even, because we're talking 2015, I always thought that to create a laboratory sort of endeavor inside of a major university would be like a 30-year long like moonshot. And it's like, oh yeah, 2015, my mind was blown and now I have a lab. That's amazing. So I want to learn how you were able to stand one up so fast.
That's funny, Dave. Thanks for that, for those words. I will say that, as I mentioned, I was about 10 years into my professional career and at the University of Virginia. And the work that I had been doing up until that time was in typical development, addressing these interesting questions. But after my experience and other experiences in getting to know families and getting to know autistic people, I really wanted to think about a way that I could use the skill set that I had to contribute to some of the pressing issues for this population and for this community. And, I didn't know very much about autism before 2015 or 2010 or, until about 10, 15 years ago. And as I started to dip my toe into this enormous scientific literature, I was kind of shocked by how much gloom and doom there was in that literature, because theory of mind was a prominent explanation. Then it's all about social disability. And I was also kind of taken aback by the disconnect between what the science said that the autistic people that I was interacting with are supposed to be like and my experience of what the autistic people I was interacting with were actually like. And when I got to know the families, what the families told me about their autistic folks. And how is this possible that there could be this disconnect? Again, nobody's making up data. I'm not suggesting anything nefarious in that respect. But I started to think about, as a developmental psychologist who has a lot of experience thinking about how we can design studies to reveal what young kids know. Right? Why isn't that same kind of, ingenuity and creativity being shown in the case of non-speaking autistic people in particular? Until about 30 or 40 years ago, we didn't actually think that young kids and toddlers, we didn't really think they had much going on up there, right? We didn't really think that they understood very much. Yeah. So the world was thought to be a blooming, buzzing confusion to them. And everything, from Piaget was sort of like, everything has to be learned. But over the past 30 or 40 years, we have, through these kind of clever techniques that have developed, we have learned that, my favorite examples, like 5-month-olds appear to know basic addition and subtraction, right? They know that 1 + 1 = 2 and that 2 - 1 = 1. And, how did you discover that? It's not by giving them some paper and pencil test. It's by making use of some clever methodology. In the case of these babies, looking time methodology, so that they look longer when they expect one thing and something different happens compared to when something expected happens. And so you can take advantage of that kind of just natural tendency to notice violations of expectation that's present very early on in order to investigate questions like, do they recognize that 1 + 1 = 2 and 2 - 1 = 1? Now, those questions, like, they weren't asked to address questions about mathematics. They're asked to address questions about epistemology, like, does a baby understand that objects continue to persist in time and space even when they're out of view, for example? And so, even though I'm a developmental psychologist and I wasn't formally trained in autism science as a graduate student, I spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how can I apply the kinds of things I think about and have been trained in to questions about non-speaking autistic people and communication in particular. And, something I admire greatly about Barry and have been inspired by his work is this kind of understanding that autistic people, children, adults, autistic people are developing, right? It's not like there's this static thing that's called autism that just never changes over time. Somebody is going through the world being affected by the people that they interact with, by the opportunities that they're offered. And, I think about this a lot in the context of non-speaking autism, because I think non-speaking autistic folks often aren't offered the opportunities that speaking people and non-autistic people are offered. And that's probably because a lot of assumptions are made about their abilities and their interests and their underlying competencies. But gosh, nobody has spent the time to try to understand whether those assumptions are actually true, or God forbid, ask non-speaking autistic people, what do you think is interesting and what would you like to know about? So,
well, it's an interesting thing too with the psychology of it, because going back to like the addition subtraction example, perfect example of how what you're actually the child intuitively can see that 1 + 1 is making 2 of whatever it is quantity, right? What you're actually giving them is the language that enables us to agree on what that concept is. So the child looks at it and says, like, yeah, that's this many of that, but we give them the language that says 1 + 1 plus. Okay, now we've got some kind of mathematical function happening, right? And or an operator. And then when you get into more like further down the line and you start developing more and more, we'll say, I guess, sophisticated or complex topics to discuss, you need more and more. We lean into the language of it, so it's almost like the language gives us a transactional channel to support that. Yes, we're all talking about the same thing, which is not the same thing as the thing you're talking about.
Yeah, just because you don't have the language yet to be able to articulate the concept doesn't mean that the concept doesn't exist. I think that's really interesting, important insight.
And if I could interject, it's not only, the point that you mentioned that we're not giving people the opportunities to communicate and maybe learn how to communicate. We're actually putting up barriers and restricting those. I mean, so, how many times I've heard, well, ignore the child's gestures because he has to speak. So in the past, we've actually been told that you don't want this child to communicate in a way that you, as a neurotypical ableist person, value, that the child must communicate in only the way that you value. And we're not going to look at the child as communicative otherwise.
Yeah.
Right. That's like, and by the way, just one little joke here. I work with Italians. You can't ignore gestures when you're talking to somebody. Those gestures say more than words, but go ahead, Vikram.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's exactly right, Barry. And I think a lot about, from the perspective of an autistic, non-speaking autistic child or adult who doesn't yet have access to an effective way to communicate in a language-based manner with others. Imagine how frustrating that must be to have the only means, or one of the few means in which you can communicate, suppressed in some way for no good reason, because of these assumptions that actually are not true. As you just pointed out, I mean, there's excellent research in typical development to show how important gesturing is to the development of spoken language, right? Or yeah, I mean, it's just so frustrating, and must be so frustrating for those individuals. And also, I think, right, uh, preventing people from having access to their most effective way to communicate is appalling. It should not be something that anybody tolerates.
And if I could add one word to the mix, frustrating, traumatizing. And that we're getting more evidence of that, from autistic people who could share their experiences. If you're not first of all, you're having problems communicating, and then you feel you're not heard, and then you're shut down, that could be a traumatic experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, one of the things I very much appreciate about your work, Barry, and the way that you talk about development is this recognition that all these experiences that autistic people have are affecting them just in the same way that all the experiences that non-autistic people have affect them. And why should we think that being denied or prevented from communicating wouldn't be a frustrating and traumatizing experience for autistic people when we know the same would be the case for non-autistic people? So this the puzzle why we have these such stark categories that make us think that some experiences will affect one group but not another group. No, we're all humans. We're going to be affected by these kinds of things.
Yes, yeah. and in part, this is what the vision and the mission of the Jaswal Lab is all about. That was a wonderful kind of little rabbit hole we went down, but I really want our listeners to understand, what are you doing in that lab and why are you doing it?
So my experiences with the non-speaking autistic folks that I've gotten to know, and their families and parents and community members and practitioners, as I mentioned, I think these folks, they're the ones that inspire the research that we do. And there are a number of really pressing issues that come from the community that need to be addressed. And so one question is like, oh my goodness, there are so many challenges. How are we going to decide what to focus on? So again, I spent some time thinking about how I could best make use of the skills that I have in the moment to be able to contribute, hopefully in a meaningful way, to the community. And so the first line of work that we spent some time working on, and this was a study published in 2020, was some research that really tried to get at an issue that non-speaking autistic people who communicate with assistance have faced for decades. And we may get into a little bit more about some of this controversy later, I'm not sure, but non-speaking autistic people who I had the privilege of getting to know in that summer 2015 seminar, and since then, these are folks who communicate with assistance from a trained communication and regulation partner. And in the case of the particular individuals that I spend the most time with, they communicate by pointing to letters on a letterboard held vertically by this individual. And the practitioners who support these individuals and the individuals themselves have explained that this CRP, communication regulation partner, is really helpful, essential, in that they provide attentional, regulatory, emotional support for an individual. And remember, these are folks who have not traditionally had any way to communicate effectively prior to this. And so there's probably a lot of trauma, as you just mentioned. There's also a lot of attentional issues, a lot of conditions that go along with autism that are not even related to autism, anxiety, like these co-occurring conditions, which the CRP is able to help provide support for. So, but one challenge for any method of communication that involves the assistance of another person is that there is the potential that that person who's assisting a speller is influencing them, is getting them to point to particular letters, to spell particular words, to say particular things. And now, to be clear, right, influence is part of communication. Generally, doesn't matter whether you're a non-speaking autistic person, you're an autistic person, you're a non-autistic person, right? It's like just part of the way communication works. So I see Barry is back channeling, and he's nodding his head as I'm talking, which is giving me the confidence to continue. And so like influence occurs in a lot of different ways in communication generally, but it is true that if somebody is assisting another person to communicate, there is a risk that that assistant could direct a user to particular letters or to spell particular things. Mm-hmm. And this is a criticism that has gone on for decades. And it is something that the non-speaking autistic spellers who I know are absolutely aware of. They're absolutely aware that in many contexts, their abilities are questioned, and their use of these methods is not allowed in some school contexts, for example. And we were talking about trauma earlier, not having a way to communicate. And imagine now that you have worked very hard on the skills to be able to communicate by pointing to letters with the assistance of a CRP, and now you learn that there are people who don't believe what you're saying, that there are people who want to deny you access to that method and related methods of communication. So that's only going to contribute further to somebody's trauma. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so, I'm a cognitive developmentalist. I spent a lot of time with cognitive scientists, and our first effort to try to make them understand this influence possibility was just to do what I consider to be a characterization of the phenomenon in the wild. So what does that mean? That means, like, if you have the chance to spend time with non-speaking autistic people who communicate in this way, one thing that you'll notice is that many of them, not all of them, but many of them spell very quickly. Mm-hmm. The other thing you'll notice is that many of them are really accurate in their spelling. Mm-hmm. And, there's some reason to think that there are limits on the human information processing ability to make use of cues from the environment in order to drive our behavior. So an example is like, I don't know about you, but like if you're at a restaurant with your family and, one member of your family wants you to notice the person's shoes at the table next to you. Right. They might make a subtle cue, nod their head in a particular direction or roll their eyes over there. And you have to notice the cue, detect the cue. You have to interpret its meaning. And then you have to decide, like, how am I going to act based on that cue? Mm-hmm. So these things, this detection of a cue, this kind of noticing that it occurred, this figuring out what it means, and then this action program after having understood it, like those things take time. Right? So each of those steps takes time. And so as I have spent time with non-speaking autistic people who spell, many of them spell so quickly and so accurately that I think it just is beyond belief that they're simply responding to cues that many of the rest of us wouldn't be able to notice sitting next to them that the CRP, the communication regulation partner, is offering.
Which is the major argument that people who don't believe that this is valid communication use, that it's all just responding to another person's cues. It's not authentic communication.
That's right. Some kind of cue that some CRP is offering. Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
But even when we watch it in real time with our own eyes, like, is this a "don't believe your lying eyes" kind of counter argument? Because, like, when you watch somebody who has a communication partner, and they're spelling, and the communication partner is just articulating the word that was spelled. If these are cues, I mean, these are sleight of hand, Vegas magician cues, because you can't see them. Even somebody like me who's very new to any of this, I look at it and I'm like, all I saw was somebody looking at what was being pointed at and then forming the word for us. That's all I see. So anyway, but
I think you're absolutely right. The criticism comes from the belief that the communication and regulation partner could be offering some subtle cues that are undetectable to many of the rest of us, and that the autistic person who's spelling is somehow detecting and making use of in order to decide what letter to point to, in order to be led to point to a particular letter.
Now that would be a superpower.
That would be a superpower. I mean,
That would
and there are, there's a huge literature out there. Again, right? It's problematic in many ways. It wasn't investigating this question about influence potential, but there's a huge literature out there that suggests that autistic people are not very sensitive to cues that other people give. Right. And even though that might not be true, like, to now have the critics, claim that these folks are somehow, have this superpower, as you described it, Barry, to be able to detect subtle cues that many of the rest of us wouldn't be able to detect is hard to imagine. So, but having said that,
yes,
what we did in the study that in this first study was to use eye tracking to investigate how quickly and accurately non-speaking autistic spellers looked at and pointed to letters on the letterboard. So this is a characterization of the phenomenon as it happens in the real world. So they're wearing this pair of glasses that has a couple of cameras attached that allow us to record where they're looking, where they're pointing, and to investigate like the relationship between looking and pointing. So in a nutshell, what we found, and this was a unique sample, for sure, this was 9 non-speaking autistic folks who communicate by spelling and had experience learning this method for at least a couple of years. What we found was that they pointed to about 1 letter per second on average. So they're moving along at a pretty fast clip. And they were really accurate. So they rarely pointed to a letter that didn't make sense in the context of what was being spelled. And we also found that their eyes preceded their point to most letters by about half a second. And so they're anticipating the next letter they're going to point to. It's not that somebody is moving their board under their finger, and is the thing that's responsible for producing the message that the individual is apparently producing. No, these folks are agentically choosing which letter to point to, and they seem to, from our data, be responsible for the messages that they produce.
Mm-hmm. If I could just add a very common sense analogy so our listeners can kind of get this. And, think about when you go to the airport and you're checking in for a flight and it asks you, what's your confirmation code or what's your frequent flyer number? You're scanning the screen and you are visually searching out the next letter or number in the code. And that's what you're describing, but you scientifically measured it.
That's right. That's really good analogy. I think like the other thing to think about is, we know that for the most part, the actions that we take to interact with things in the world, for those of us who are sighted, are guided visually. And so if I'm reaching for my glass of water, I'm going to look at it so that I can be sure to get my motions, my movement, calibrated in the right way in order to pick up the glass. Mm-hmm. If I were to, do it without looking, I might get it, particularly if it's in the same place as I had it last time or something like that. But I also might knock it over. And so most of our movements are visually guided when they're directed toward objects. And so this study, we argued, demonstrated communicative agency in this sample of non-speaking autistic spellers. They were looking to letters before they pointed to them, and they were moving at a clip that was much too fast to be explained by responses to subtle cues that were being provided, subtle, undetectable to most of the rest of us, cues that were being provided by the person who was supporting them.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, without going too deeply into this, the naysayers, the people who don't believe, are making these global statements that any person who is using spelling or typing with assistance, that it's not authentic communication. They're saying pretty much flush that down the toilet. We don't believe any of that. And unfortunately, that ended up being a statement of caution that my association put into a position paper. But the point is that you're being very conservative about your interpretation with 9 non-speaking people, yet people who have been critical of this being authentic communication are saying, well, never is. Yeah.
Right.
It is a frustrating situation because I think in a lot of cases the critics don't always engage with the data in a meaningful way, and so I mean there are alternative explanations, presumably, that one could generate for the data that we obtained, for example. But to my knowledge, folks haven't actually attempted to engage with those data, and they haven't attempted to do research on their own to try to investigate their alternative explanations, such as they are, right? So it's it's a complicated and challenging space, for sure.
And I'll just
But that's why this.
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to say that's why this is so important to actually put scientifically derived, peer-reviewed data on the table and say, all right, refute this. I mean, it's funny that we have to do it, but at the same time, as an engineer myself, I want to see data that backs up claims, especially when something's in dispute.
Mm-hmm. And it really does beg the question, which we've discussed before on the podcast, of evidence-based practice. And so you're talking about experimental research, but we also have the experience, as you and I have had, speaking to dozens of families and parents and people who are spellers or typers, which has been totally dismissed as any aspect of evidence here by the naysayers. Yes.
Yeah.
So, when we were at Motormorphosis at the conference, I met one of your research assistants, and in addition to the work and demonstrating the authenticity of communication for the people that you've studied, and the agency of that communication, you're also looking into other related areas, especially around regulation, or you're planning to do that. Yeah. Which, of course, is a great area of fascination. So if you could...
Sure. The graduate student who I have the privilege of working with, who's working on that project, his name is Caden Stockwell, yes. And he's really interested. Again, this is a question that comes from the community. A lot of non-speaking autistic people have explained to us how important feeling regulated is to their ability to do just about anything. Of course, communication, but also to be able to sit still, the ability to take in information from what other people are telling them and so on, right? So regulation is key to lots of their experiences, and dysregulation makes it really difficult. Mm-hmm. And, like in my department at the University of Virginia, there's a very prominent social affective neuroscientist named Jim Cohn. And Jim's research over the past 20 years or so has nothing to do with autistic people or non-speaking autistic people, but has demonstrated really elegantly and conclusively that other people's presence can make us feel regulated, particularly if they're close others, particularly if we have a strong relationship with them. So the classic study that he did in the early 2000s involved romantic partners, and one person would be lying in an fMRI scanner, and occasionally they would receive some cue that indicated there was a certain probability that they would receive a shock to their ankle. Okay, so this is an experimental study, right? So, but the idea was, can we engender or arouse some kind of response that's this anticipatory response in the brain of something negative about to happen? And what Jim and his colleagues showed was that the response in the brain to those predictive cues of a shock about to occur was dampened in the emotional centers, emotional areas, when the person lying in the scanner was holding the hand of their romantic partner compared to when they were holding the hand of a stranger or holding nobody's hand. Right? And it's just the presence of somebody with whom you have a close relationship that can have this kind of dampening effect on the arousal that the person would otherwise experience. I mean, which, I think we all have probably experienced that informally. Like, it can be easier to encounter a difficult situation when you're with a partner or a parent than when you're by yourself, right? Because you've got this trust, you've got this bond. This is not voodoo we're talking about. This is not, woo-woo stuff. This is something that social psychologists and neuroscientists and clinical psychologists have known for decades, right? That other people can really influence how regulated somebody is.
And that's
and that other person doesn't necessarily become proxy for it. They become a regulation, for lack of a better word, tool or resource or partner. And you just answered a question that I had this whole time that I didn't even know how to really, speaking of putting language to things, how to even articulate it. So I haven't asked it yet, but you just answered it, which is, would we see the same results if we banished the communication partner to another room for the next 6 months, and we gave this person a text-to-speech apparatus that was, electronic, automated, and that apparatus used artificial intelligence to put the words together and say, yes, this is the sentence that we feel confident going into. It's because that apparatus may or may not be having the same human calming effect, or I shouldn't say calming, human regulating effect that a trusted partner has. And my God, I don't know a single, we talk about like different degrees of quote unquote functioning. I can't think of a single executive who rolls into a very high level meeting without his or her little buddy there, whether that's the attorney or the regional salesperson, who is there as a safety blanket to make sure that that person's message gets across. And we don't challenge that. So you're answering all these questions. So this is wonderful.
Well, you're raising all these excellent questions too. I mean, one of the things which we may get to that we're thinking about in collaboration with some colleagues at the University of Calgary is how we might be able to automate some of the things that a communication and regulation partner does, not the human connection, obviously. And it is actually an open question, the extent to which you could provide automation of some of the things that a CRP provides. I think that human connection is always going to be important, but it's an interesting question whether there are certain things that the CRP provides that could be offloaded to a automated system.
Yeah, it does beg the question, though, of the responsivity of whatever that automated device might be, because the one thing that I still remember when I used to teach child development classes is how could you explain kids being raised in totally different cultures, like on a cradle board with a mom who's out in the field 8 hours a day, as opposed to an American upper middle class couple where there's a lot of face-to-face interaction. And what is the one factor? Responsive caregiving. So it would be interesting to know if that responsivity could be built into that, but that's a whole other thing.
That's fascinating. Well, so
without inappropriate cultural influences informing the AI and blah blah blah, like
this opens up a whole other can of worms for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, so the other interesting piece about Jim Cohn's study was that yes, participants who were holding the hand of a romantic partner showed the dampened effect in the emotional centers relative to those who were holding the hand of a stranger or not holding somebody else's hand. But actually the quality of the relationship, even among the romantic partner dyads, that also had an effect. So, if you're on the verge of, if you're not connecting very well, and you say that you're not connecting very well in various questionnaires that are given to you before the study, then the effect is much less than if you say that you are. So it's like there's some trust, as you were just suggesting, Dave. There's some trust, absolutely, that's important in this whole phenomenon. So one thing that's really puzzling, it's both frustrating and fascinating. I mean, it's good for Caden and this, as a graduate student coming up, like to have this domain that nobody has looked at it, but it's kind of frustrating to recognize or to realize that actually nobody has asked these kinds of questions in a rigorous way about autistic people, let alone about non-speaking autistic people. Right? I mean, like, because of the assumptions that autistic folks are not socially motivated. These are erroneous assumptions in my view, but that they're not socially motivated. They wouldn't care what other people think. They don't get much benefit from being around other people. Nobody has really taken the opportunity to ask these questions in a rigorous scientific manner. And so Caden's study, what he's just embarked on, I don't know what the data will show, is sort of investigating whether non-speaking autistic people show better regulation in terms of heart rate variability. So that's a measure of arousal or regulation when they're in the presence of a trusted other compared to when they're with a stranger, compared to when they're by themselves. And so just as we were talking earlier about how sometimes you have to think about creative ways to ask these questions, traditionally, in addition to that fMRI scanner, which, for a variety of reasons might not be appropriate for a non-speaking autistic person, you have to think about clever ways to ask these kinds of questions. And so what Caden landed on was heart rate variability, which can be measured using a wireless sensor. And, it's important that we innovate and that we think about how we can make use of tools to ask questions of populations that haven't yet had these questions asked them, because it could inform the kinds of support that is offered to members of this population later. I mean, I think about non-speaking autistic kids who are in school who may not have an effective way to communicate. Sometimes the paraprofessionals or the aides who are assigned to them, I think they're wonderful people, but sometimes if that person is sick or if that person moves away, there's a tendency for people just to be swapped in, right? And you can imagine the kind of anxiety that would provoke in non-autistic people if the person who you rely on for all kinds of things is suddenly not available, and some new person who you haven't had much time to spend with them and you don't know much about them is swapped in. That would cause anxiety for anybody. And I think the assumption is that in non-speaking autistic kids, it doesn't really matter.
Just to connect some dots for some of our listeners, similar concepts have been brought up. It'll be interesting to line them up and see where they overlap and don't overlap. And those concepts are what we use in the CERTS model, mutual regulation, which comes out of the infancy research, and then co-regulation, which also. But again, I think there's overlap with what we're talking about, and certainly the whole notion of looking at heart rate variability and objective measures for non-speakers is wow.
I love that piece about co-regulation, mutual regulation, because the other great piece that Caden has generated in this study that he's embarking on is to measure heart rate variability, not just in a non-speaking person using these wireless sensors, but also in that trusted other and also in the stranger, so that through some really sophisticated quantitative analytic techniques, he'll be able to look for the kinds of synchrony that may occur when you're with a trusted person compared to when you're alone, or compared to when you're with a stranger, which speaks to the regulation piece, that mutual regulation piece that you were describing.
Yes.
You just pointed out something that it's funny. It never even occurred to me, and I'm surprised that it didn't occur to me that, yeah, you're right. At some point, a human being becomes incapable of being your communication partner, whether it's for a day or for the rest of that person's life or whatever. And it is. I hadn't even thought of the fact that while this is awesome, if your partner has to move away because their spouse now lives, got a military job somewhere on the other side of the world, whatever it is, you're thinking, oh boy, like that person was my mouthpiece, and we worked well together.
Again, just a quick example on that point that I think anybody can relate to. You're traveling to a country where you don't speak the language. If you know some locals there and they are with you, you are much better regulated going into a store, going into a restaurant. If a person is not with you who can be your communication regulation partner, at least for me personally, I feel very anxious asking for something to eat in German, even though I took a course or two in German in college.
Yeah. No, I think I think we all benefit. Going back to my colleague's work, that social baseline theory is what Jim Cohn calls it. I think we all benefit and don't even recognize it. And that's why he calls it social baseline theory, because the idea is that we've evolved to be with other people, and not being with other people is the exception.
Yes.
And so the resting state is expecting that there will be other people who can be who you can offload various concerns and anxieties and so forth to.
Yes. So my feeling is, especially with, I'm feeling like, let's make this to a two-parter and go on for another hour. but just to help us kind of land in the lives of people that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. You've had the opportunity now not only to meet initially, but also to meet repeatedly. And we did this twice, actually, on our podcast with somebody who Ian, where 3 years apart, we interviewed Elizabeth and Ian. But how have the lives changed of people that you've known over the years where you first met them, the tribe, and maybe through reports of Elizabeth, knowing them in some cases for a decade or two. But what have you observed in your interactions?
So one thing I think that's really important to emphasize is that all of the folks who I know who communicate by spelling are working on the skills to be able to type independently. And some have gotten to that point where they can communicate independently by typing. Nobody holding the keyboard, nobody touching them, and so forth. That is their goal, and that's been their goal all along. There are lots of reasons why it can take time to get to that point. And different people will take different amounts of time depending on all the other co-occurring challenges that they're facing, the motor difficulties that they're having, and so on. So one thing that has just been remarkable to observe is the heterogeneity in the trajectory, how much variability there is in the trajectory of folks who are working on the skills to be able to type independently. And it's interesting, among those who type independently, they still benefit from the presence of another person who can serve as that regulation, to your point, Dave, that regulation partner, and who is able to redirect them where their ADHD leads them astray, for example, or their OCD leads them to focus on something, that person who can help them to get back on track. So that's one thing that I've just been really, it's been interesting to observe. I think a second thing that's been interesting to observe is how much more confident and regulated a lot of folks who I know who now have a number of years of experience communicating have become. It's not to suggest that it's all attributable to the ways in which they are communicating now, but I do think that obviously having a way to express yourself, to let people know when you're not feeling well or when you're feeling great, or whether you want to have Cheetos or Doritos for a snack, all those things are going to contribute to your sense of autonomy, which, as we know from developmental psychology, is so important for development and for in typical development, it's thought to be crucial for allowing somebody to become to develop the identity that they have. And I guess the third piece, speaking of autonomy, is that it has allowed a lot of folks that I know to develop a lot more autonomy in the community than they would otherwise have had. And so, there are folks I know who were members of the tribe who now live independently with support in an apartment complex that's set up in such a way so that the neighbors know them, there's community programming that everybody engages in. They they do live with support, meaning like a roommate who's there in the evenings should something they need help with something, like if the fire alarm goes off and so on. We all can use somebody to help us figure out what we should do. So those kinds of opportunities would not have been available to folks who didn't have a way to communicate their desires, in part because, as one mom told me not long ago, she never really thought about the fact that her daughter wanted to live outside the family home. She just assumed that the mom just assumed that for the rest of this person's life they would live in the family home because they assumed that's what they wanted. And her daughter explained, no, of course I want to live independently. Of course I want to live out on my own. I mean, as independently as I can with support in the community. Right. I don't want to live in a family home forever. Anyway, so those are some of the examples that come to mind.
So I think it's accurate to say, even though it may sound like an oxymoron, is that self-determination comes with support. Yeah. And when you talk about autonomy, I just keep on thinking of self-determination, and
Right.
but it isn't a pill that you take and you're self-determined.
No.
You need that trusting person around you, that safety net to take risks and get out there. So
Well, and I know you talk a lot about this, Barry, and Dave, you were alluding to it earlier, but like, we are interdependent. That high level executive or the president of the United States or whoever is going to come in with people who have prepared him or her for the meeting that they're going to have. Probably, I once heard disability studies scholar talk about, President Obama has this group of people around him, and probably they provide him with lots of important information about what policies this meeting is going to be about and what the stance of so-and-so is on it and so forth. But they may also remind him, now you need to take some time to use the bathroom because you're not going to have time for three more hours, so like,
right.
That's probably important for us to keep in mind, that we are interdependent. We are all relying on each other. And why should it be any different for a non-speaking autistic person who may have particular kinds of needs that we don't have, but then we may have particular kinds of needs that they don't have and that can benefit from the support of another person.
So true.
Absolutely.
So
true. And the blind spots too, that so whoever your partner is, or partners, your tribe, so to speak, who are going to be helping you achieve that interdependence. Of course, they're going to have blind spots too, and I think it's incumbent upon the people who are in the entourage to understand that, hey, we might have some blind spots, so let's keep checking in with the person and making sure that we are supporting. A perfect example, my son Parker just so Parker and Emily both volunteer in the summers at a camp called Adams Camp, and it's for it's for young adults, kiddos on the spectrum. It's for folks with Down syndrome. It's for it's just a fun week-long camp up in the mountains. And my son Parker was just there this week volunteering, and he came home, and one of the stories he related was, it was funny, one of the parents dropped off their son with this very long list of things that he cannot do, he cannot engage in, it won't go well, this is bad, this is, and the list was published amongst all the volunteers, everybody was aware of it, and then what they were observing was, wait a minute, this young guy is doing all the things that it says on the list, like don't push him to do this because he can't. And I think it's very important to make sure that the entourage is actually there in an appropriate supporting role, and not lending actual disability to somebody who's actually quite capable.
Oh, I love that example, because again, it speaks to disability writ large, but in the autism space in particular, as we were talking about a while ago, like I think there's this belief that autistic people are fixed, that they're not going to change or develop. And of course they're going to change and develop. And what you said about checking in with people and not making assumptions based on history, of course, history can guide, can inform what you're expecting, but like you should be ready and able to be surprised. I mean, we can never really know another person. And so we need to check in with them to make sure that, as you just said, to make sure that we are understanding their needs and desires and goals in the way that they want.
And it also brings up the concept, almost like the elephant in the room concept right here, and that is assuming competence, as opposed to assuming incompetence. And on that note, I think, Vikram, maybe we have to do just another whole episode on assuming competence and as it relates to non-speakers and so forth.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much. And we will be looking out for more of your published work and more of your presentations, because what you're doing is not only incredibly innovative, but it's changing lives of families and changing lives of individuals. And it's just so important. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Barry. Thank you, Dave. It was a pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.